Assalamu alaikum. We will begin with some numbers. We have heard some numbers, so today I am going to complete the picture of type 2 diabetes. As the final aspect of diabetes, Dr. Saira Bani covered gestational diabetes, Dr. Aziz Fatma covered type 1 diabetes, and I will now bring the ball full circle and complete the majority of the patients of diabetes, which are type 2 diabetics. So, as of 2003, which is the last time we had a major survey, it was estimated that there were 230 million diabetics in the world. Pakistan was sixth among the leading countries in the world with the highest number of diabetic patients. Which brings us that why do we need to screen for diabetes? In Pakistan, every 10th person may be a diabetic. And if we include the lesser degrees of hyperglycemia, which we consider as pre-diabetes, the number may be even higher, 1 in every 5. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, because the majority of the people who do have diabetes do not know that they have diabetes. 50% of people who have diabetes are actually undiagnosed for several years before they actually come to the attention of the medical practitioner. And when they do come to the attention of the medical practitioner, half of them already have evidence of complications, which is why we need to screen for undiagnosed diabetics. This figure very clearly shows, and it's that the onset of complications, if this is the type of diagnosis of diabetes, the onset of complications is about 5 to 10 years before the actual diagnosis is made. So a lot of damage has been done. So we must screen for diabetes among those people who are apparently normal, because these are people who are already starting developing those complications which are going to be such a major burden for the healthcare in the future. So this is the key message I want you to take with you. So whenever a person comes to you, an apparently normal person, do proactively try to look for the presence of type 2 diabetes, and this screening must be done in every person after the age of 45. If the person has normal sugar at the age of 45, you can rest. You can do it again in about 3 years' time. But from the age of 45 onwards, every person must be actively looked for the presence of diabetes. So how do we diagnose diabetes? The criteria have been covered, so I will just briefly skim over them. 4 different ways of diagnosing. You can diagnose based on the fasting blood glucose. You can diagnose based upon a formal oral glucose tolerance test. You can diagnose based upon a laboratory hemoglobin A1C, not the finger hemoglobin A1C which is seen in many diabetes camps. Or you can diagnose based upon a simple plasma random blood glucose level, provided if the person has classical symptoms of diabetes. The criteria have already been discussed. But what I want to emphasize is that beyond this bullseye of diabetes, there is a bigger rim, the bigger picture of pre-diabetes, which we must see, we must focus, and we must diagnose. And why we must diagnose, I will come to in a moment. So what is pre-diabetes? Pre-diabetes encompasses an impaired fasting glucose level, or an impaired response to glucose tolerance test, or a hemoglobin A1C which is not quite diabetic but is less than diabetic. And the criteria are a fasting blood glucose of between 100 to 125, which is not normal but is not quite diabetic, 2-hour post-oral glucose tolerance test result of between 140 to 200, which is not diabetic but is not normal, or hemoglobin A1C of between 5.7 to 6.4, which again is short of diabetes but is above normal. So all these people are pre-diabetics. So why do we need to screen these people? Why do we need to increase our burden, detect those people who do not have diabetes? Because these are the people who are going to go on to develop overt type 2 diabetes. And remember, I told you at the time of diagnosis of overt type 2 diabetes, the complications have already started. These are the people you need to target to prevent the development of diabetes. These are the people you need to target to prevent the development of complications. In impaired glucose tolerance, where a glucose tolerance result is not quite normal but not diabetic, there is a 6-fold increased risk of developing type 2 diabetes, a 4-fold risk of developing overt diabetes with impaired fasting glucose. And when both of these occur together, when the fasting is high and the 2-hour post glucose is also high, the risk is 12 times higher. So this is something we need to take notice. Can we revert this prediabetes? That is questionable. But we can definitely prevent the progression of these people to overt diabetes through various methods, lifestyle modification and drugs, and we have very convincing evidence. And this is a very famous trial, you must have heard of it, the Diabetes Prevention Program, which suggested that intensive lifestyle modification can reduce the risk of developing of diabetes in these people with pre-diabetes by almost 60%. And this is even more effective than metformin. Lifestyle intervention is more effective than pharmacotherapy. You lose weight by about 10%, you reduce the risk of developing diabetes by 60%. So we need to ask our patients, the patients need to ask themselves some tough questions. So a person comes to you, now we are talking about this person who is possibly a diabetic. What should you look for? At every visit, what should you be looking for in every diabetic patient? So it is simple. It is not rocket science. In every person who comes to you, you must look, what do they know about their diabetes? What is the level of their diabetes education? What is their lifestyle? What are the risk factors which they're walking around with? What is their glycemic control like? What is the level of comorbidities they're walking around with? What is the blood pressure? What are the lipid profiles? And what complications have they developed? Because remember that even if this is a newly diagnosed diabetic, this person may have complications already. And this is where both the physician and the patient need to set targets. They need to set what are they aiming for. Because when you know you're aiming for a target, you achieve it. When you're just walking around without a set target or a goal, then you never achieve anything. So you need to set targets. What glucose levels you need to have, what lipid profile you need to have, what blood pressure you need to have. And both the physician and the patient must actively work towards achieving those targets. A systematic patient evaluation is essential so that you do not miss anything. That is why the list is there. Do not miss any of these aspects. You cannot be blindsided by one aspect. You have to look at everything. So a newly diagnosed person comes to your clinic. The first question has been covered to some extent already. We need to ask, is this person a type 1 or a type 2 diabetic? Because sometimes it is very clear-cut. This is type 1, this is type 2. And sometimes you're not very sure. There are intermediate degrees of hyperglycemia which you cannot sometimes very clearly classify. But the large majority are either type 2 or type 1. And the phenotypic difference between type 2 and type 1 has just been covered, so I will not go into great detail in that. But there are supporting labs available. When you really cannot make a differentiation between type 2 and type 1, we have evidence from the laboratory. In type 1 diabetes, the presence of autoantibodies is a very strongly suggestive of type 1 diabetes, and the presence of insulin resistance markers is very strongly suggestive of type 2 diabetes. And both of these parameters are available in the laboratories. And if you send your patient who you are not sure about to an endocrinologist, he can sort the matter out for you. Pictures worth 1,000 words. So a person is no longer a new diagnosed diabetic. This is a long-standing diabetic, and he comes to you in the clinic. The first question you must ask yourself is, does this patient have complications? And again, we are going to have a number of sessions about complications, so I will not go into great depth into them. But remember, a person with a history of frothy urine, nocturia or swelling, think of nephropathy. If the person has painful hands and feet, burning pains in the hand, numbness of the hands, or weakness of the proximal muscles, think of neuropathy. If the person has visual deterioration which is not improving without glasses, if the person has floaters or distorted vision, think of neuropathy. If the person has classical symptoms of angina, or in the absence of classical symptoms of angina, if the person is feeling short of breath on exertion, think the person may have cardiovascular disease. If the person has pain on walking a certain reproducible distance, that is intermittent claudication. Think the person has peripheral vascular disease. Again, recurrent foot ulcers, gangrene, limb ischemia, absent pulses. Think peripheral vascular disease. But the question is that if the person doesn't have any of these, can you definitely say the person doesn't have complications? I want you to think back to the picture which I showed you. The majority of people who have complications do not have symptomatic complications. They may have complications at the time of diagnosis and may not know them. So that is why it is important to screen for complications. Even if you do not have historical evidence of complications, you must actively screen for complications through a targeted physical examination and through appropriate laboratory investigations, which will be covered in the second session after this. Next thing, you must see that a person with diabetes generally has a number of comorbid conditions associated with diabetes. A person may be frequently hypertensive and dyslipidemic, and together hypertension and dyslipidemia along with truncal obesity and dysglycemia constitutes the metabolic syndrome, which is basically a syndrome of increased risk of dying from a cardiovascular event. Other associated features which you must look for are polycystic ovaries and obstructive sleep apnea and a fatty liver. Again, these are commonly missed because we do not look for them. Treatment of diabetes is not rocket science. It is simple. So you look at the patient's lifestyle, you adjust, you modify his risk factors. If the person is smoking, you make him quit. And there are a certain number of oral or parenteral anti-diabetic agents. You use them, you adjust the doses of those treatments, and you treat to a certain glycemic target. You look for the presence of comorbidities, you look at the levels of the comorbidities, and you treat them to a certain target. You look for the presence of diabetes complications, you screen for them, and you manage them. It is not rocket science, but we will go through them one by one. The first thing, again, remember the lessons from the diabetes prevention program. Lifestyle modification is worth twice the effect of pharmacotherapy. Lifestyle must not be missed. What is lifestyle? It is basically weight management. A weight loss of between 7 to 10% reduces the risk of diabetes significantly. So how do you achieve weight loss? Through planned physical activity, not just sair kar le, but so many minutes of walk a day at this time, and how to do it. Medical nutrition therapy, as opposed to just simply asking ki meetha na khaya karo, specific, targeted dietary advice. This is what you eat in this quantity at this time. And then medicines and surgery. So what is planned physical activity? Two types of activity can be advocated: exercise and strength training. How much should you exercise? At least 150 minutes of moderately intense aerobic physical activity, which is a fast walk and certain equivalents which I have given here. If a person is unable to do that, the resistance training, that is working out with weights, is extremely important. It changes your body composition of the patient, and it enables that person to achieve a better fat to lean muscle ratio, which will change his insulin resistance. So resistance training is very important. We hardly ever advise our patients this, but this guidance is available, gyms are available. We should ask our patients to do that. This is what I hope to see, not this. Then the medical nutrition therapy. There are a number of diets available. Some people say low fat, some people say low carb, some people say other Mediterranean diet and whatnot. It doesn't matter. The bottom line is that there should be weight loss, and weight loss is more important than individual diet. It should be giving between 1000 to 1200 kilocalories. And again, the bottom line is that whatever causes the weight to change towards a more favorable direction is the ideal weight, is the ideal calorie count. You cannot just say one calorie count for everybody. Everybody has a different metabolic rate, so therefore that should be targeted to whatever is causing a negative weight change. So then, weight loss drugs, is there any role? Remember, I have crossed out sibutramine. You should cross it out from your prescriptions also. Do not prescribe. It has now been withdrawn. Orlistat is a useful drug as an addendum to people who cannot maintain weight loss through lifestyle and exercise. This does help, but has certain issues such as flatulence, such as vitamin deficiency, so these need to be addressed when you give a person Orlistat. Bariatric surgery should not be ignored. If a person has a body mass index of greater than 40, or a diabetic person has a body mass index of greater than 35, this is an option if nothing else is working, because bariatric surgery can actually reverse diabetes. But modulation of risk factors must not be forgotten. You must ask the person to stop smoking at every visit, and you must not smoke in front of him. And you must not smoke anyway. Okay? Smoking kills. Coming on to pharmacotherapy, diabetes medication. There are the oral agents, there are the insulins, and then the incretins. First of all, the oral agents, briefly, the gold standard is metformin. It reduces fasting hyperglycemia. Sulfonylureas, which are more effective for postprandial hyperglycemia because they are insulin secretagogues. Thiazolidinediones, they decrease insulin resistance. Again, they may cause weight gain, but they decrease insulin resistance. Acarbose, which is an alpha glucosidase inhibitor and decreases absorption of glucose from the gut, therefore it is best for postprandial hyperglycemia. The glenides, these are again like sulfonylureas, short-acting sulfonylureas. They share the same side effect profile and the same risk factor profile as sulfonylureas. They cannot be given in insulin failure. The newer agents which we have now are the incretin-based therapies such as exenatide or the Byetta, again expensive. It has one very, very important beneficial role, that it causes weight loss. But beyond that, it has to be given parenterally and it is expensive. A risk of pancreatitis is there with it. The DPP-4 inhibitors or the gliptins are the new things in the market. They are very effective. They are insulin secretagogues again, therefore they do not have too much of a role where there is insulin secretory failure. And they do not cause weight gain. So that is one good thing about DPP-4 inhibitors. And then insulins may either be the regular insulins or the analogs. The analogs differ from the regular insulin simply in their profile of action. They are the short-acting analogs and the long-acting analogs. They just differ from regular insulin in the time at which their maximum effect lies. So the question is, there was just a list. You all know the list, I know the list. But how do the drugs measure up against each other? Is there any difference in actual capability of lowering the hemoglobin A1C? Is there any difference in the actual ability to achieve a glycemic target? Well, most of them cause a lowering of hemoglobin A1C of between 1 to 1.5%. Some, such as acarbose, are possibly less effective. Some, such as insulin, are possibly more effective. But most agents, if given optimally, cause an HbA1c reduction of between 1 to 1.5%. So how do you select the agent? So the agent should be selected according to what problem you are seeing. If the person has a postprandial hyperglycemia, it is appropriate to use an agent which will cause an increased insulin secretion in response to a meal. So these are good, such as alpha-glucosidase inhibitors or acarbose. Sulfonylureas are good, and repaglinide is good. These are all secretagogues. They increase insulin in response to a meal. Incretins-based therapies such as DPP-4 inhibitors, again, these are short-acting and they cause an increased response in increased insulin secretion in response to a meal. All of these are good for postprandial hyperglycemia. But if a person has fasting hyperglycemia, if the person wakes up with a high glucose in the morning, then the best treatment to give him is either bigonide or some long-acting insulin. For insulin resistance, the best treatment to give is either bigonide or thiazolidinedione. And if a person is morbidly obese, that is a subset where you must be considering exenatide. Again, the price may be a barrier. What are the targets you want to achieve? The targets have been covered, but basically you should aim for a hemoglobin A1c of less than 7%, a fasting of less than 120, and a postprandial of less than 140. This is good. Postprandial 2-hour, postprandial less than 140 is good. These are the targets which you should know, the patient should know, and because they are simple round figures, easy for the patient to remember. So what are the side effects? Each of these treatments comes with a cost. What are the costs of these drugs? First of all, sulfonylureas, thiazolidinediones cause weight gain. Insulin causes a lot of weight gain. But metformin causes a lot of GI symptoms. Sulfonylureas and insulin are notorious in causing hypoglycemia. If the person has impaired renal function, you cannot give bigonide such as metformin or sulfonylureas. So you have to select according to the person's profile and also according to the type of glycemic disturbance you are seeing. First, In the first slide, we covered the type of glycemic disturbance, what agent to give in what situation. In the second slide here, we're covering what agent to give in what is the price of giving each of these agents. So again, the question lies, which agent is best? What should I give? So you have to individualize the treatment. There is no one treatment for all. The bottom line is what level of HbA1c you achieve. If you achieve the target, that agent is the best. You must start with metformin unless the person is metformin intolerant or the person has significant renal failure, and then you can stop accordingly. There are certain bad choices which you should not make. Should not give sulfonylurea in a fat person. Should not give metformin in a person with renal failure. You should not give a thiazolidine in a person who has a heart failure. You should not give a DPP-4 inhibitor in a person who has pancreatitis. So these are the bad choices. And sometimes we end up making combinations which are bad. For example, you can combine two. It makes no sense to combine two agents in the same class. I see all the time patients taking dimicron and Emeril. Dimicron subah lete hain, Emeril sham lete hain. What's the logic of that? They are both the same. It's just like having two brands of the same thing. Do not combine sulfonylureas with insulin because they have the same mechanism of action, and when you're giving insulin in a patient with insulin secretory failure. So you do not give sulfonylurea with insulin. Combination of TZDs with insulin is not very safe. It may cause fluid retention and may send into patient with heart failure. A lot of people come to us कि डॉक्टर साहब वो तो दवाई ली थी तो उसके बाद तो हम सारा रात emergency में गुजार के आए हैं. Why? The patient went into pulmonary edema. This combination of thiazolidine and insulin may send the person into trouble. This may reduce the risk of complications, reduce the risk of mortality, reduce the risk of infections. It reduces the cost of care, reduce the burden on you, reduce the burden on society. Tight glycemic control is the bottom line. And the algorithm is simple. Start with lifestyle modification, titrate, give monotherapy, up titrate according to the glycemic level, try combinations, and finally you might need to put the person on insulin. The treatment it should be based upon the pathophysiology, and you should target the maintenance of beta cell function. The comorbidities are there and should be managed. The blood pressure, remember that the blood pressure goals are that the blood pressure should be less than 130/80. In certain very older and frail people, you might want to go for a higher blood pressure, 140/80, because you're not so sure about what would happen with the blood pressure is too tightly lowered, but otherwise lower it to the target, 130/80. The first line is an ACE inhibitor, or you can add up a calcium channel blocker as a second line, or a third line can be a diuretic. Again, the bottom line is treat to target, achieve the target. You must not rest by giving one drug and just leave it be. You should check the blood pressure at every visit. You must make sure that you are meeting the targets. Lipids. A person who doesn't have cardiovascular disease but has diabetes, his LDL cholesterol should be less than 100. If a person has, in addition to diabetes, cardiovascular disease, you're now looking at a target of 70. Difficult to achieve, but you have to achieve it. A triglyceride level should be less than 150. An HDL should be greater than 40 and greater than 50 for women. So, therefore, it stands to reason, because you never see these levels. So, all patients who are older than 40 should be given statins. With exception with those who have very low cardiovascular risk. And if the person is younger than 40 still, and still if the risk is bad, you must give the person a statin. If the person's lipid profile does not come back to the targets, then you add on, you increase the dose of statin, and if this doesn't work, you add a fibrate. If a person has hypertriglyceridemia to start with, fibrate may be the first line treatment also, but then this is generally very high triglycerides, something like more than 400 or 500, because generally the triglycerides are initially just a result of hyperglycemia, and they vanish after the treatment of hyperglycemia. Is there any role of antiplatelet agents? In men older than 60, yes, if their blood pressure is not high. Because if the blood pressure is high, you send them, you reduce the risk of cardiovascular disease, you increase the risk of stroke. But younger than that, probably no rate. And there is virtually no role of clopidogrel except for that very, very rare person in whom there is genuine aspirin intolerance. So again, the key message is not enough to put in a statin, not enough to put in an ACE inhibitor. Look at the target at every visit, treat to target. That's the bottom line. And something which is very near to my heart, I want to bring it up, the children with type 2 diabetes, it pains me to see them. About 30 years ago, about 3% of children with diabetes had type 2 diabetes. Today, the number is between 50 to 80%. Again, we in Pakistan don't have our figures, but I see fat children in every school. And fat children in every school eating packs of crisps and walking around with Coke bottles in their hands. This pains me. What are we doing it? But while looking at that, remember we made a distinction with type 2 and type 1 in children also. The fat child is likely to be type 2. But remember, a fat child is not immune to type 1 diabetes. So if a fat child has presence of ketones and has stigmata of weight loss, think this child also can have type 1 diabetes. Again, what should you do? You should obviously make them lose weight. You should make them lose weight but achieve the growth at the same time. Should aim for near normal fasting blood glucose levels, near normal HbA1c, and again the criteria which Dr. Fatima told you in her lecture about children's, that remains the same whether it is type 2 or type 1. You should aim between a hemoglobin of A1c of less than 8.5 in very young children and less than 7.5 in older children, and once the child is in adolescent, you may even aim for less than 7. And if you are not meeting the targets with exercise, with diet, then you start the treatment. What treatment? Metformin can be the first line treatment, second line really don't know, there are no results, no trials. But most of these children will not achieve a glycemic control without insulin. That is painful. Their pathophysiology doesn't demand insulin, but their behavior, their lifestyle demands insulin because they will not achieve glycemic control. A very large study called the Today study was reported last year. They managed to treat 700 children with type 2 diabetes. And only 30% of them, 1/3 of them, were able to achieve glycemic control on metformin. Another third achieved the combination of metformin, thiazolidinedione, and then that was it, khalas. In 30%, glycemic control was impossible to achieve. So, children with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, may again have comorbidities at the time of presentation, just like any type 2 diabetic adult. So, you must obtain the baseline measurements for their blood glucose, for their blood pressure, for their blood lipids, and you should treat. Again, treat to target. Again, you must measure the blood pressure in the children, type 2 diabetic children at every clinic visit. It doesn't matter their children, you must measure the blood pressure, and the blood pressure should be measured or judged against what is normal for their age. So we have nomograms available. So you should look at their age-related blood pressure, and the blood pressure is above the 90th centile of that, then the person has a high normal blood pressure. It needs to be really targeted for lifestyle modification. And if it is above 95th centile, or if it is above an absolute value 130 by 80, then you need to start ACE inhibitors and treat to target again. Again, the lipids. If a person has ischemic heart disease family history, then you start checking for lipids as early as age 2, otherwise at puberty. And again, the targets are the same. Aim for a target of LDL of less than 100. You should look for the kidney function every year after the age of 10. And you should look for their eyes. The eye examination should be done at baseline and then should be done annually after the diabetes has been there for 3 to 5 years. Additional problems which these children may have may include polycystic ovaries, obstructive sleep apnea, fatty liver. Again, they have severe psychological concerns. These people may be suicidal, especially when there are career choice issues. You say, the child who's lived to become a pilot, you say you can't become a pilot, you can't drive, you're a diabetic. Children have been known to attempt suicide for that. So this is very important. Appropriate career counseling is important. This is where they have to make sensible choices, not irrational choices. And this is our society. We in our society learn to talk in euphemisms. We call these children healthy. But this is what we are looking at. This is a stark glimpse of tomorrow, where we are looking at an epidemic of type 2 diabetes. And this is a key message I want to leave you with. Eat less and move more. Thank you very much.